Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. You're at another meeting of the Maine Climate Council. Thanks for joining us, both council members, some working group chairs, and a good number of observers with us today. I bet there's among those observers many folks who worked hard in the working group, so thanks everyone for being with us today at this meeting. My name is David Plum, and I will help to run this meeting, moderate it. This meeting is similar to what we did last week on September 9th. And let me say just a little bit about what we're going to do today. And I wonder, Cassie, if you could go to the next slide, which is an agenda slide. We're going to do a quick round to start off with just naming what we heard from the feedback in last week's meeting. We think it's important to name that so that you can see like what we're taking away from this and what's being said. Then we're going to spend an hour going through the presentations that are more focused on resilience and carbon sequestration, but we're calling them our resilience strategies. And like we did last time, capable staff will be giving us some presentations, and then we'll have some quick hit reactions from a handful of folks, council members, to kick off some reflections. This time around, we're not going to go into small group work. We'll stay right here all together in this Zoom webinar for the duration of our meeting today. However, we will dedicate a good piece of our time to plenary discussion about those strategies, and we'll finish up talking about next steps and what we're taking away and the work ahead into October. Okay, so that's what we're going to do today. Again, we're on Zoom. It is, you know, all the beautiful things and terrible things about doing this virtually. If anybody's having some audio trouble, I recommend, as I always do, to switch to phone audio. It's not a hard thing to do. It allows you to keep the video going while having clear sound. One other thing, this is a public meeting. We are very fortunate to have a lot of people interested in this meeting. We welcome everybody here. For members of the public and other observers we have with us today, the Climate Council website, if you just Google it, provides a great pathway towards public comment. And so we welcome you using that. Okay, great. So let me turn it over to your two co-chairs of the Maine Climate Council, Director Hannah Pingree and Acting Commissioner Melanie Loisem, to kick us off today. Hannah, do you want to start?
Yes, great. Well, thank you and welcome everybody. It's good to see you all out there, and it's great again to have so many members of the public and our working groups also joining us. Melanie and I continue to be grateful for the time and effort so many of you are putting into this. I know nearly everyone on this call and participating has other real jobs, and so your commitment and time and energy in the putting towards the Climate Council is again incredibly appreciated. So I just posted in the chat the cost of doing nothing report, which I know you've all had emailed to you and sent to you many times. I put the summary of the Eastern Research Group's all of their work in the chat, but the cost of doing nothing is a powerful one. It's certainly about the risks of allowing climate change to continue unabated, which is really the bulk of our work to reduce emissions. How do we slow the impacts of climate that we know are happening in Maine and around the world? But it's also squarely focused on the impacts of not preparing Maine for the impacts that we know are coming. Whether it's adapting our infrastructure before it strands us on coastal peninsulas, inundates wastewater treatment plants, but it also is about supporting industries that we know will need to innovate and change to deal with the environment, ocean, and forest season changes. Today, we're here to talk mainly about how to adapt and make Maine more resilient to these coming impacts. So I'm sure the news is pretty stark out there about climate. Today's Portland Press Herald has a headline about the smoke aloft in the atmosphere that has been impacting our sunrises and sunsets. I'm sure many of you have seen the glowing orange sun, which is beautiful but disturbing. Maine looked hazy yesterday, and I was actually grilling Melanie about, is this smoke that we're seeing, and now as we know from news reports that the smoke, again, high up in the atmosphere, it's not impacting our air quality, but it is changing the way we see the world right now, and it's impacting as far as Europe. Actually, I learned yesterday that Maine DEP has 2 meteorologists, so now we know there's another subject you can grill Melanie on. Yesterday's New York Times was also incredibly stark with a huge top of the fold story about the coming climate migration. With increasing and absolutely devastating forest fires in California and on the entire West Coast, Hurricane Sally's hitting Alabama this morning, coastal flooding and hurricanes across the East Coast having more and more impacts, and heat challenges causing increasing health issues. We know climate is going and is shifting our world and societies in ways that we're only starting to contemplate. So preparing our state of Maine for these shifts and threats now is essential. California wildfires have provoked a lot of COVID climate comparisons this past week, sort of a new type of comparison. Economists have been talking about the economic disruptions of COVID, which we know have been devastating to Maine, but how they will pale in comparison to future climate disruptions. The slow nature of climate change has made the communal action that Dr. Shaw talked to us about last June harder. But today, late this summer, and watching the catastrophic impacts in parts of our country have made it more obvious than ever the need to take action. While it's certainly heartbreaking, especially the loss of life, homes, communities, and environments, the importance of this process and the role that each of you have to play in helping us getting this right is absolutely essential. So again, I know you're all following the news, and absolutely no one can miss what's happening. But again, thank you all for joining us here today, and I'll pass it to Melanie quickly for a welcome as well.
Thanks, Hannah. It's good to be here again with everyone. As Hannah said, DEP has been involved with climate change issues for some time. We tend to go into the weeds, and in that vein, I thought I might highlight for you some of the things that we've been grappling with, some that are relevant for today's discussion about resiliency. For example, policies for upstream stormwater management must be informed by changes to water chemistry in nearshore tidal environments. Wastewater plan designs have to take into account higher storm flows. But then on the other hand, irrigation systems must be modeled against severe drought and low flow conditions. Climate change has become a part of everything we do, but the choices that must be made keep getting harder. So on behalf of everyone at DEP, we're grateful for all of your participation in this council and your willingness to help all of us chart a path to meaningful action.
Great. Thank you, Melanie. Brian, do you want to just put up the slide about the themes, dilemmas, challenges? So while we get that up, so the last meeting last Wednesday, in case any of you forgot, we had, I think, really helpful discussions, just hearing the questions that people have, a lot of sort of discussion on process and, somewhat agreement on many of the strategies, or at least sort of initial big picture agreement, but a lot of detailed, important questions about how do we make it happen. So Melanie and I are just going to go through a couple of the things on this slide that I know are relevant. To some degree, we'll be kind of asking, sort of reminding you of the questions you asked, and actually helping to put some of those questions back on your plate, because certainly we don't have answers for every important question about how we get this all done, but that really is part of the role and leadership of the Climate Council. I will say, again, we're going to cover most of the things that came up. There were a few very detailed questions that we'll get back to people, some people in writing. But I will say the good news is the public shared some of their same questions with us, and they matched a lot of the same issues. Concerns about implementation, funding, how do we measure the progress? So it's helpful to hear our public members, again, many of whom are actually probably our working group members who've been really engaged and important to this process. We've had a lot of the same concerns. So first, I would just say on communications and education, that really was one of the most significant topics you all hit and talked about. And I think the thing we're all grappling with is How do we present what we come up with to the public to gain support? How do we get people to accept new ideas and changes that we know are needed for Maine's people and communities? How do we use convincing arguments about risk and urgency? But maybe more importantly, what are the places where cost savings, innovation, incentives, ways to make people's lives better, create jobs? How do we use those co-benefits to convince Mainers to take action? What are the means for reaching out to different constituencies to spread our messages? Rural communities, young people, low-income Mainers, small businesses, diverse communities. Lots of questions about how do we make sure that we're being heard, not just by kind of the choir, the convinced people who know what's happening, but a lot of people whose lives are busy and they've got other things going on. How do we engage Maine kids and young people in the questions that will have a big impact on their future? So the question, this is a kind of a question for all of you, really, this is the role of the Maine Climate Council. I think this work, how we accomplish this is not going to be a perfect answer by December 1. It's going to be probably one of the most important long-term aspects of our work. And for those of you who just to remind you, this is a Climate Council that's been appointed and will continue, and we don't go away. So the council will continue to meet quarterly in the coming years, and this work is going to be essential to our long-term success. I think the council will probably specifically consider towards the end of our process in December whether or not we set up a long-term communications and education group. How do we continue to focus on these issues of informing people? So the next issue of reaching our targets, there was certainly questions for the council to address about how to get Maine on a path to our 2030 target, a 45% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. So I think as people noted from the modeling that we are close to 90% of the way there. So how do we grapple with closing the gap? We are creating a 4-year action plan to start getting us on the pathway to this reduction. But obviously we'd all like to see modeling that shows us the exact roadmap of how to get there. So I just want to be clear that this is an issue that we'll talk about in October. We haven't missed it. Some of the new modeling we have shows us getting all the way there by 2050 with obviously significant changes and some heavy lifting work that needs to be done to get there. But the 2030 question, again, is one that we will consider. We will probably go back to some of our working group chairs on the mitigation side to ask them how we should manage this. And we may do more modeling to figure out how to get on that pathway. So I just want to be transparent about that. The next thing is there was a bunch of questions about measures and metrics, and I'm going to pass that to Melanie to talk about that as well as the priorities and sequencing.
Thanks, Anna. So as a reminder for everyone, Maine law requires that we produce a report every 2 years tracking our greenhouse gas emission reductions against a 1990 baseline. Our target is the 45% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. Until now, those biennial reports only included gross emissions, but by beginning in 2022, DEP is going to be calculating both gross and net emissions, but only the gross emissions will be used to assess our progress towards the statutory emission reduction goals. Just as a reminder, net emissions are gross emissions minus the amount of carbon that's been sequestered, and we will be using that net emission calculation to assess our goal again, to assess our progress against the governor's goal of carbon neutrality by 2045. So both of those numbers are going to be meaningful, but just so that everyone understands the distinction between the gross emissions, net emissions, and which targets we're lining those up against. I believe there were some questions that came in asking how we calculate emissions. So just to run through that very quickly, our emission calculations are based on activities that occur within Maine's borders. So for a real life example, my parents use heating oil that was produced in the Western United States. We would calculate the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that result from them burning that oil. We'd calculate greenhouse gas emissions from the truck that delivers that oil to them, but we don't count the greenhouse gas emissions from producing that oil out of state or transporting it to our border. And this is the same calculation method that's used by other states and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And we've all been using this method for a long time. And the benefit of that is it enables us to compare our emissions and our emission trends against, all others in the country and at the federal level. These calculations include reports. The way that we do the calculation is we use reports of actual emissions from our licensed facilities. We use energy consumption data from the Energy Information Administration and a wide variety of other state-specific activity data. And while our method hasn't changed, the quality of the data has improved significantly over the years. And our DEP emission inventory staff are continuing to work with our stakeholders and the regulated community to identify the most accurate information to use in those calculations. So we had some additional questions about how to establish priorities and sequencing. And like I said last week, and as Hannah mentioned earlier, our work is not going to be done when this plan is produced. We all have a lot of work ahead of us. And you're hearing the recommendations from the working group. And now is the time to think about how to prioritize those strategies that are being recommended. The plan that we're developing is going to be a plan to guide all of our work for the next 4 years and thereafter. And it's going to be the role of the council to recommend for all of us which strategies you think need immediate implementation and which can be sequenced to come later. So some things to think about as you're hearing these recommendations. Consider which of the actions are the highest priority. Think about which ones are going to achieve the greatest greenhouse gas emission reductions, particularly thinking about their effectiveness and what costs may be associated with those. Think about short-term, medium-term, and longer-term goals and strategies, and which of these recommendations also have co-benefits for us for economic recovery. Now, when you're thinking about how to sequence the strategies, I think we all understand that there are other processes that are going to be involved here. So not everything can happen at once. Some of these strategies are going to require legislation. Some would require rulemaking. Many of them are going to require funding, and we need to figure out where that would come from. Many of them require action by local governments. And many also are going to need some public education or awareness to gain public support. So if thinking about all of these things seems a bit daunting to try to figure out how to sequence all of these strategies together, again, remember this plan is just one step. This isn't the end. You're stuck with us for quite some time to come. And you don't need to be able to answer all of these questions now. The plan is to give all of us some direction. And the details of implementation are going to evolve through the various stakeholder and public engagement processes that accompany lawmaking and rulemaking. So as we all work our way through implementation of the strategies, as Hannah mentioned, we want the council to continue to meet quarterly. We'll be tracking progress, and we're going to need the council to help provide us support for implementation of these efforts. And with that, I'll turn it back to Hannah.
Great, thank you, Melanie. Well said. So the next question of funding, probably among the most important and also challenging. So obviously that's part of the process of prioritization. So how do we fund those items that are the highest priority? What combination of mechanisms can be used that's equitable, that shares the burden? I think there was discussion by at least Commissioner Van Noot about how do we share the burden with visitors. Which existing programs will need stable, sustained, or enhanced funding to provide the needed incentives to change behaviors, to encourage new choices, to fund long-term monitoring? There's a ton of challenges of funding across the board with the varying recommendations we've gotten so far. So I will just say that this is a question that we've all probably talked about. I certainly get it all the time. And there's no one or easy answer. It will be a topic of significant conversation in October. What are the items that we can implement and we are implementing now in state government? I think as many of you saw from the overall membership of the council, we have a ton of commissioners engaged, commissioners who are actively putting together their budgets now. And while those budgets are in a challenging position as we're seeing drops in state revenue, commissioners do have the ability to figure out how to implement some things within state resources. So that's one potential, and I know Amanda Beal has talked about that in the past. There's also clearly a lot happening at the federal level. Right now, there's a federal energy bill being considered with a number of items that actually could be helpful for Maine if passed. We know that there's been discussion of major green and climate focused recovery. So one of our focus areas is how can our Maine projects really be shovel ready for that kind of federal opportunity. Obviously, there's a number of studies that have come out of the working groups, studies of long-term financing, studies of new mechanisms like a green bank to help figure out how to leverage more private capital, and there are ideas of new revenue sources. Again, a challenging area to contemplate during this economic period, but also an important area for serious discussion. So I will just say that there is no one answer on funding. Certainly in the issues of adaptation and resiliency, the funding issues are absolutely overwhelming, but long-term. So again, I think this is an area where the Climate Council's expertise, leadership, political experience will be important, and it'll be a lot of, I think, important and hard discussions. The last issue on here is equity issues, and certainly those issues came up across the board. The most frequent, we certainly have heard from all of you, as well as in the surveys that we did of the 4,000 Mainers, is about the urban and rural divides. How can the Maine Climate Council really wrestle with those? How do we make things relevant in Portland, but also in the far reaches of Aroostook County? But there are also other multiple equity considerations for how to reduce the impacts and enhance fair implementation. And I know many of you have heard that we are doing a specific equity analysis with the UMaine Mitchell Center. We are actually setting up in the coming weeks a overview for Climate Council members who have time and want to hear about that. We will share their pretty lengthy and really detailed equity report in the coming week with all of you. So I think that wrestling with these issues, the impacts of equity, especially in our implementation, is again going to be something that's ongoing. So actually, next slide. So just, I mean, Melanie and I wanted to kind of go over questions. We encourage constant questions about process. I think process and implementation is going to be the challenge of this council. So again, thank you all for being so honest. Thanks for the public members for their questions and comments, but just keep them coming, because we want this process to be transparent. We certainly don't know, I don't think anybody knows the answers to all of the questions of how we're going to make this happen. But clearly there's urgency, there's a lot of good ideas on the table, and it really is now up to all of us and then the agencies and Maine people and communities who will help us implement these strategies, and it's going to be a long-term work in progress. So again, where we today, we heard in June the 6 working group reports. Those again were the over 100 strategies that are incredibly robust and good about how do we tackle climate change. So the next slide is, we have taken all of the strategies, we have not changed them, but we have tried to put them in the new framework of the 2 sides of implementation of Maine's Climate Action Plan. This again is just a draft for the council to wrestle with, but today what we're talking about is part 2. How do we prepare Maine for climate change impacts? So we have 3 strategies with multiple actions underneath them. 1, to build healthy and resilient communities. 2, to invest in climate-ready infrastructure. And 3, to protect Maine's environment and natural resource economies and promote natural climate solutions. So this was, again, our staff attempt at a new draft of taking basically what came out of all the working groups, lots of overlapping ideas that should be kind of brought together. We've put them in a new report with some of the cost benefit analysis, some of the public comment, and that's what you're going to hear today from Brian and Cassie, who are going to go through these new strategies. Again, it's a draft, it's a work in progress. None of these are ideas that you've all agreed to. Certainly it leaves out a lot of the detail of implementation, and again, that's our kind of ongoing task to think about how do we make these things happen, but just understanding the broad strategies and agreeing to them is kind of the first thing that we need to tackle. So with that, I'll pass it back to David to walk through part 2 and hand it off to Brian and Cassie.
Thanks, Hannah, so much. If we want to drop the slides just for a second, I think we have a moment to do a quick round. If people have clarifying questions for Melanie or Hannah about this framing, right? Where we are, what we're doing, and that feedback we got from you last week and how we're adapting and dealing with that feedback. So before we get into the content of today's presentations and the content of those strategies, do folks have any clarifying questions or doubts based on what Hannah and Melanie just said? Go ahead and you want to raise your hand in the Zoom or try to wave it loudly at me. Let's try to see you. Any clarifying thoughts or questions that are bugging folks about sort of where we are and what's going on here? Yes, go ahead, Representative Bloom.
Thank you. I think it's really shows a lot of work on GoPIF's part of what the trying to get this structure in place. I guess my question is, if we, in studying this and learning more in some of these focus sessions, really feel like something is missing, how are we going to, propose that? How are we going to say we really feel that this X should be in there and it's not, or we really need a cost benefit analysis of something that's not in there? How is that going to, how are we going to proceed that way?
I think that David is going to go through some process actually after the presentations, sort of initial what's missing. But obviously, as Kate Dempsey admitted at the top of the call, she hasn't memorized everything that we sent you yesterday. So the process is people should definitely take time to read these things over again. You will hear public and lobbying over the coming weeks of something that's missing, and this is a work in progress. And so I think people should absolutely raise that in the public meeting, with staff, with the working group chairs as well, why did this not come out of your group report? So great question, Lydia, and definitely a really important area to stay focused on. Again, we are creating a 4-year action plan, and we are trying to kind of figure out how to put everything into it. But next year there could be some kind of major groundbreaking change about how people are thinking about dealing with climate, and we can adjust this plan next year as well. So just know that while we're trying to create a complete and comprehensive kind of approach to climate for Maine, this is, again, work that's never done. So I don't know, David, if you want to comment at all on the process.
I'll add one just quick thing, and we'll talk at the end of the call about what October is going to look like and how we're going to be making decisions and all that good stuff. But I will say there is space for bringing up compelling issues, right? And so there's absolutely space to bring up things where you look through, you're like, well, where's this thing that's really, really important? And so that's clearly part of our job in the coming weeks, is to identify those gaps, if there are gaps. Where there's not a lot of space is to say, can we go off and do another set of analysis of cost benefit or things like that? Because we simply don't have time, and I'm pretty sure we don't have budget to do additional work in that way, analysis work. So I just want to flag that up, that we're kind of where we are in terms of the amount of analysis and consultant time and all that we can do. Although I'll happily stand corrected, Hannah, if that's not the case. But there is time to put issues on the table, debate those issues, and find where you as a council can most speak as one, right? Where there is broad support for a set of very compelling ideas. And that's what we're really going for. Does that make sense?
It does, and but there's something that I want to also bring up. This approach has to be an all of government approach, and one of the things that we have not talked about at all is what the Attorney General is doing and what possibilities there are for joining suits related to climate change. And I would like to request a briefing by the Attorney General's office to this council that talks about what possibilities they see for the state of Maine to be joining into lawsuits. And that's a possible funding thing, just like the Volkswagen settlement. That could be really important. And I think it's just something, it's part of all of our, the all government approach that we need with this crisis. So I wanted to see about making that as a formal request.
Yeah, good suggestion, Representative Bloom. We're happy to talk to the Attorney General about that. And I know that that's certainly the subject of other states. And I know the Attorney General has been involved in some suits. So good suggestion.
Great.
I also saw there was a question that just came to me about public comment and the letters that people are receiving. And I know some of you, we haven't shared your emails with the public, but many people found your email and you're receiving kind of the ramp up of lobbying about Climate Council activity. So we are compiling all the public comment. We have a deadline of September 24th for additional public comment. We will bundle it and fully share it with all of you to the extent you have time to read it. We have obviously received significant public comment as a part of our survey process. We tried to summarize that and share it with you, but we are happy to give you access to the full cache if that's what if you want. So we are receiving a lot of thoughtful comments from people, from associations, from different groups, and again, we will try to provide ways to analyze that, but again, we're going to give you the raw data as well. So just to the extent people have time, we do encourage you to read what people are saying.
Thanks, Hannah. Are there any other questions before we get going in on the substance today? We good? Okay. Great. Excellent. Okay, let's get going on the substance then. Again, these are our resilience strategies. You'll hear talk about carbon sequestration as part of it. And Brian Ambrette from Hannah's office is going to lead us off and combine two of those strategies together, the Build Healthy and Resilient Communities and the Invest in Climate Ready Infrastructure. We'll do the same thing as before, where we'll run through these presentations, all three of the strategies. We're going to get some quick hit reactions from about 5 or 6 of you. Then we're going to take a break, and then we'll do full plenary discussion amongst all of us for a good piece of time so that we have a chance to digest, think, react. All right. So Brian, why don't you take it away and start giving us an overview of these strategies, please.
Great, thanks David, and good morning everyone. My name is Brian Ambrette. I'm the Climate Resilience Coordinator in the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. And Cassie, if you could pull up the first slide, that'd be great. The Build Healthy and Resilient Communities strategy has 4 action areas: enhance and coordinate assistance and funding for community and regional resilience activities, improve the planning and legal tools that communities use to build resilience, invest in public health monitoring and education, and protect water sources from contamination due to high intensity weather events. The first 2 of these come from the resilience planning subgroup, and the last 2 come from the public health subgroup. Other public health recommendations were organized into the building strategy that was discussed last week, and the natural and working lands and water strategy that Cassie will be sharing in a few minutes. The emergency management subgroup's recommendation is in the infrastructure strategy that I will discuss in a moment. And as we go through these action areas, I'll be adding new context about climate vulnerabilities, benefits, and public feedback. All of the work group content is linked within the framework document, so it's all still there. Next slide. These 3 maps are examples taken from ERG's vulnerability analysis. Shown here are flood vulnerability for inland and coastal communities, heat vulnerability for certain high-risk populations, and social vulnerability, which takes into account income, demographics, household composition, disability, housing, and transportation. The takeaway from this analysis is that climate vulnerability is compounded by other factors and can vary widely across even short distances in the state. Communities with comparatively low physical risk to climate may have to contend with higher socioeconomic factors. And as is often the case, communities with high social vulnerabilities often have high climate risk as well, and will have limited capacity to prepare for or respond to floods, high heat, and other emergencies. Next slide. Lack of capacity, climate expertise, and funding are consistently cited by municipalities as reasons why they are not able to address their climate risks. To begin to overcome these gaps, the state needs to enhance assistance to communities and their regional partners and coordinate that assistance with increased funding for resilience building activities. Even though about 3/4 of coastal communities have completed climate change vulnerability assessments, many report lacking the capacity to secure funding or manage the next steps in their response. Inland communities, generally speaking, are farther behind on the curve for many of the same reasons. Only 11% of communities in Maine have a town planner on staff, shown here in the 2 shades of blue, while 72% have no local planner and insufficient or no regional resilience planning support, shown in the orange and red. Critically important to consider, many of the communities in Maine with the highest social vulnerabilities have little or no planning support to prepare for climate change. The key message is that state government's current level of assistance and financial support is significantly undersized compared to the need. Next slide. The primary benefits of coordinated assistance and funding for community resilience are improved public safety during a disaster and the avoided damage to infrastructure, buildings, businesses, and natural resources that underpin local economies and livelihoods. These benefits are typically realized only after a crisis. However, as communities do the work of becoming resilient, the leadership, networks, and practices generated along the way may also have recognizable ongoing benefits that improve public health, alleviate social vulnerabilities, strengthen the local economy, protect natural resources, and help the community weather non-climate crises. There may be additional job creation benefits of climate resilience activity, especially in the design, construction, management, operation, and maintenance of certain implementation projects. Next slide. These are all benefits that help communities thrive in a changing world, so it is little surprise that 88% of survey respondents viewed this action positively. A public commenter noted that assistance tools must be both consumer-friendly and relevant in order for towns that have limited resources to find them useful. Next slide. Updating the planning and legal tools that communities are already using to prepare for climate change is critical. Many of the tools were initially written into state law decades ago for non-climate related purposes. When these tools, many of which are related to land use planning and floodplain management, are updated for the climate era, communities will have more functionality, proactive options, consistency of definitions across statutes and programs, lower permitting burdens, and a modernized regulatory review process. Next slide. Climate change is expected to result in negative health outcomes related to high heat exposure, vector-borne diseases like Lyme disease, and waterborne illness. High heat offers an example of the health costs that climate change will have in Maine. By 2050, Maine people can expect 9 to 14 days per year in which temperatures exceed 90 degrees. This is up from an average of just 1 day per year for the 1970 to 2000 period. Maine's older building stock has a far lower prevalence of air conditioning than warmer states. So as the temperature rises and people cannot escape the heat, heat-related illness will rise. By investing in monitoring and education, Maine can work to avoid these illnesses and avoid the $2 to $3 million in annual heat-related healthcare costs that are expected, as well as the treatment costs related to Lyme disease and other health impacts. In addition to avoided healthcare costs, the benefits of public health monitoring include improved situational awareness for medical professionals, local and state leaders, and Maine's residents and visitors. While monitoring climate change impacts alone will not address issues of equity, making the best use of a wide variety of data at the individual, neighborhood, community, and county levels can provide a more complete description of the underlying factors that influence health outcomes. Using the insights drawn from monitoring data, along with the best health literacy practices to tailor education and other programming to vulnerable populations, will help address issues of health equity across the state. And 87% of respondents thought improved monitoring education were good fits for their community. Next slide. Waterborne disease was of particular concern to the public health subgroup. There are nearly 2,000 public drinking water systems in Maine, and many of these, including Sebago Lake, the source water for Greater Portland, rely on surrounding forested lands to filter pollutants. If these source waters are contaminated, the remediation and treatment costs are very high. Protecting source water, as well as downstream waters that receive discharge, not only safeguards public health, but carries very high avoided costs. EPA estimates that every dollar spent on protection avoids $27 in future treatment costs. Water system protection also improves wildlife habitat, recreational opportunities, and downstream waters for fisheries and beach communities. And 88% of survey respondents favored this action for their community. Next slide. The second strategy in part 2, preparing for climate impacts, is investing in climate-ready infrastructure. This is a truly interdisciplinary strategy, as these action items are sourced from 3 working groups. The first, regularly assessing the vulnerability of Maine's infrastructure to climate hazards, came from the Transportation Working Group and is a sound plan for all types of infrastructure. From the Emergency Management Subgroup, provide technical assistance and seed funding to state agencies and towns that will unlock federal funding for infrastructure repairs and upgrades. And from Coastal and Marine, give particular attention to infrastructure and the partnerships vital to Maine's working waterfronts and seaports. Next slide. Inland, coastal, and sea level rise induced flooding are not the only climate hazards that will affect infrastructure, but they are likely to be the most significant. ERG notes in their executive summary that flooding will be the largest overall threat in Maine. The Science and Technical Subcommittee recommends a 2-part strategy for sea level rise planning, encouraging decision makers to commit to managing 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050 as a probable scenario, and as a precautionary measure, preparing to manage 3 feet of sea level rise by 2050. A public commenter makes the crucial connection between long-lived investments and the prudence of factoring sea level and flood projections over the lifetime of a project into its initial siting and design. Next slide. Maine's transportation infrastructure illustrates the need to regularly assess the vulnerability of all infrastructure to climate hazards. By 2050, 26 miles of roadway and 7 miles of rail will be permanently underwater. Long before these become permanently impassable, they will be subject to monthly and eventually daily high tide flooding, degrading their safety and reliability and requiring expensive maintenance. Below Maine's roads are tens of thousands of culverts. The vulnerability assessment by the Nature Conservancy identified 2,300 of these culverts that are undersized and have a 2 out of 3 chance of overtopping or washing out in the next 30 years. The benefits of doing vulnerability assessments and tracking maintenance on infrastructure include more realistic long-range planning of maintenance and replacement costs, access to federal infrastructure funding, lifetime cost savings for repairing or replacing under-designed infrastructure, and avoided public safety, environmental, and economic impacts of infrastructure failures. 82% of respondents favored vulnerability assessments. Next slide. Maine has a $325 million backlog of projects that reduce risk of natural disasters or make infrastructure more resilient. While there are significant federal funding sources that could be drawn on for these projects, federal grants typically require states and towns to put up as much as a quarter of the project cost. For infrastructure projects costing millions of dollars, this cost share requirement is simply out of reach for many of Maine's communities. A new infrastructure adaptation fund and pre-development assistance could help towns and state agencies meet these cost share requirements, unlocking federal funds and bringing millions of dollars into Maine for infrastructure projects. The Federal Emergency Management Agency reports that every dollar spent on pre-disaster risk reduction and resilience projects saves $6 in future avoided damages. 88% of respondents favored an infrastructure adaptation fund. Next slide. The value of lobster landings in Maine in 2019 was $485 million. Maine's working waterfronts are especially vulnerable to sea level rise, but also to the economic impacts of climate-related changes in fisheries. The Coastal and Marine Work Group recommended a $1 million fund to support towns and business owners in planning for sea level rise and other climate impacts. The fund would augment existing grant programs and improve the resilience of local maritime economies, all of which can preserve and enhance Maine's iconic coastal towns and fishing industry. 84% of respondents favored supporting working waterfronts in this way, including a commenter from Western Maine who wraps up this presentation better than I can. The protection of coastal areas, waterfronts, and fisheries will have a direct impact on all people of Maine. That is a sentiment that can and should flow in all directions across our state. With that, thanks for listening, and I'll turn it back to David.
Thanks, Brian. Great. Okay, so those are two of the strategies. And then Cassie is going to walk us through the third one. So Cassie, why don't you go ahead and start? Thank you.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everybody. I'm Cassandra Rose, the Senior Science Analyst and Maine Climate Council Coordinator here at GoPIF. This morning, I'm talking about the strategy to protect Maine's environment and natural resource economies and promote natural climate solutions. Maine people value our state's iconic environments and the species that live within them, from our rocky coastline to our forests, blueberry barrens to diverse farms. These natural resources provide our state with clean water and food, recreation opportunities, and support significant economic activity and jobs. This strategy addresses protecting our environment and natural resource economies from the impacts of climate change, as well as promoting cost-effective natural climate solutions to both reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and better adapt to climate change. You heard these strategies in June from the Natural and Working Lands and Coastal and Marine Working Groups, as well as the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee's final report just released this week. And I apologize, my cat would like to join us. The first action area suggests several methods to protect Maine's natural and working lands and waters, both for humans and the species that rely on them. These environments support several industries, but also provide important co-benefits like habitats for climate-sensitive species, flood control, carbon sequestration opportunities, and clean drinking water, among many others. The second action area supports Maine's natural resource-dependent economies, including forestry, agriculture, recreation and tourism, and fishing and other coastal and marine businesses. I am so sorry. This is life on Zoom these days. The health of these industries is inextricably linked to the health of our natural and working lands and waters, making this action area strongly dependent on the first. And the third action area addresses improving our land and water management to increase the already impressive amount of carbon sequestration that Maine's environments provide. Improving carbon sequestration in Maine is essential to enable the state to reach its goal of carbon neutrality by 2045. The last action area supports all of the others by urging improved monitoring to understand and manage the response to climate change. Maine has rich natural resources both on land and in its fresh and saltwater environments. We have the longest coast in the contiguous US at over 5,000 miles, including our many islands. And our lands and waters support many iconic Maine species, including moose, loons, and lobster that are among many threatened by the impacts of climate change. They are also the backbone of many natural resource-based economies in our state, contributing billions of dollars to our economy and supporting tens of thousands of jobs. Without healthy and vibrant environments, our natural resource-based industries will be much more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Maine's natural and working lands and waters are both subject to the impacts of climate change, as well as a powerful solution for reducing those same impacts. Our abundant forests and forest soils and wood products sequester an amount of carbon that's equivalent to 75% of our annual greenhouse gas emissions, making this an extremely important resource for carbon sequestration and achieving our carbon neutrality goal. The Gulf of Maine is the backbone of our fisheries, yet it's at particular risk from ocean climate change as its sea surface temperatures warm faster than 99% of the world ocean. In the ocean and on land, over 2/3 of Maine species are vulnerable to impacts from climate change. Our natural and working lands and waters also offer natural climate solutions to climate change, which have a 6-to-1 return on investment on average, according to the National Institute of Building Sciences, as well as important additional benefits, including flood control, carbon sequestration, and habitat and drinking water protection. Maine must protect and conserve our natural and working lands to protect against the impacts of climate change and to maximize the opportunity to sequester carbon. And we can help make our natural and working lands more resilient to the impacts of climate change through a dedicated, sustained funding source. This action also suggests revising scoring criteria for state and federal land conservation, funding sources to incorporate climate mitigation and resiliency goals, and conserving areas of high biodiversity value and areas that support land and water connectivity and ecosystem health, which are key for species trying to adapt to climate change. The benefits of this action area include the protection of forest and farmland, especially scarce prime agricultural soils, less vulnerable wildlife and natural resources, which in turn reduces the vulnerability of Maine's people and economies that rely on those resources, more secure timber and food supplies, supporting Maine forest product industry and supporting long-term food security. And 94% of respondents to the Natural and Working Lands Working Group survey favored this action for their communities, noting that dedicated funding can bring additional stability to our forestry, agricultural, and outdoor recreation and tourism sectors. Increasing technical assistance will enable natural resource users and managers to support climate change resilient environments on land and in the ocean. Natural resource management that takes into account climate change not only helps species more successfully adapt, but also supports our outdoor recreation and tourism economies that are dependent on healthy and abundant native species and habitats. This action also suggests that we ensure smart development, shoreland protection, and appropriate renewable energy project placement, improving regulatory approaches to protect coastal areas from development that will affect the health of these habitats, especially in the face of sea level rise, and strengthening tools for stormwater management to reduce nitrogen and other pollutants, which contribute to some negative impacts on those environments. This action area promotes climate adaptive ecosystem planning and management using nature-based solutions as well. Nature-based solutions provide effective and lower cost protection for climate change related challenges while providing important co-benefits like erosion and flood protection, especially in coastal and marine areas. As I mentioned on my last slide, nature-based solutions on average provide a 6-to-1 return on investment, according to the National Institute of Building Sciences. 89% of respondents to the Coastal and Marine Survey favored this action for their communities. And this interesting quote from one of the public responses to the Coastal and Marine Working Group survey highlights how Mainers are thinking of using Maine's natural environments also as a nature-based solution to public education about climate change. Natural and working lands are currently being developed at around 10,000 acres annually, a rate that's expected to increase through time. If trends continue, Maine will lose the ability to store large amounts of carbon at a significant social cost. Conserving forests is one of the more cost-effective strategies to help reach carbon neutrality and has the important benefit of habitat protection as well. High initial investments in forest protection are often more cost-effective for protecting forest lands in the long run, according to ERG's analysis. Protecting forests through a climate fund can also offset a large proportion of Maine's emissions compared to other land conservation strategies, saving over 12.7 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent between 2020 and 2050. Maine has several industries that are strongly linked to the health of our natural resources, including farming, fishing, forestry, recreation, and tourism. These industries need information and technical support and tools to adapt to the intensifying impacts of climate change, as well as to take advantage of new opportunities brought by climate change. In order to address the pressing need to sequester as much carbon as possible and to build resilience within our natural resource industries, this action recommends providing technical assistance to our land and water users, including forest landowners and managers, agricultural producers, fishermen, and aquaculture businesses. 90% of respondents to the Natural and Working Land Survey favored this action for their communities. With approximately 90% of the food that we consume currently coming from outside of Maine, increasing our capacity to grow and process food in Maine will also ensure that a greater proportion of our food is produced using climate-smart practices. Providing financial support can strengthen our food system so that more food can be produced and processed locally, distributed efficiently, and priced affordably for Maine people. This action also recommends providing technical assistance to coastal and marine stakeholders for climate adaptation mitigation while managing for the resiliency of our marine fisheries and aquaculture industries. This includes providing clear information, forecasts, and tools that's relevant to business planning, creating a coastal and marine information exchange to help facilitate information and tool delivery, establishing a Maine Seafood Business Council to provide Maine seafood harvesters and related coastal and marine businesses with access to business relevant information and tools, and also ensures that the fishing industry is able to access new market opportunities as species move in response to warming waters. 89% of respondents to the Coastal Marine Survey favored this action for their communities. Forestry and agriculture and fishing are absolutely going to be impacted by climate change, but ERG's cost-benefit analysis shows that the impacts to tourism are much larger, both in terms of jobs lost as well as fewer numbers of tourists due to poorer winter tourism conditions and sea level rise. To illustrate this point, the beaches and towns in York County alone, otherwise known as the Maine Beaches region, brought in over 13 million people in 2018, with potentially up to 8.8 feet of sea level rise by 2100. Tourism spending in this region may drop by $1.67 billion annually due to the loss of 97% of the dry beach area due to sea level rise. Nature-based solutions mentioned in the last action area may offer longer-term solutions to impacts from sea level rise and higher returns on investment than hard infrastructure. They also have important co-benefits like carbon sequestration, as I will mention in a few slides. Maine's natural and working lands and waters are a vital component of achieving our state carbon neutrality goal, as I mentioned at the top of this presentation. As mentioned before, an initial carbon budget by our Scientific and Technical Subcommittee and the University of Maine estimates that our forests and wood products alone sequester carbon equivalent to 75% of our annual emissions. However, we can do more to enhance carbon sequestration in Maine. This action recommends that Maine conserve and restore coastal habitats that naturally store carbon, also called blue carbon optimization. Coastal ecosystems like salt marshes and eelgrass beds are an order of magnitude more efficient at sequestering carbon than forest on a per area basis, though we have far less area of these habitats in Maine. However, they can become a source of carbon emissions if they're not protected and allowed to adapt to sea level rise. 87% of respondents to the Coastal Marine Survey favored this action for their communities. This action area also suggests that Maine create new and update existing financial incentives and support for private land management and infrastructure. This will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and support adaptation in forest, agricultural, and natural lands. In addition, developing and improving marketing programs for Maine forest products for climate-friendly, bio-based wood market innovations like cross-laminated timber and wood fiber insulation can help sequester more carbon in durable products. And 90% of survey respondents to the Natural and Working Land Survey favored providing financial incentives and technical support to help farmers, loggers, and landowners prepare for the climate change impacts to their communities. As I mentioned before, conserving forests is one of the more cost-effective strategies to help reach carbon neutrality, with various scenarios ranging from about $4 to $20 per metric ton of CO2 sequestered between 2020 and 2100. For perspective, these are fairly low on the cost per CO2 range. Working forest conservation easements are cost-effective and ensure that timber is harvested and keeps forests as forests. Farms in Maine are presently a net source of emissions to the atmosphere, but ERG's analysis noted that increasing crop cover, reducing tillage, and increasing nutrient management practices can help reduce those emissions. As I also mentioned before, coastal environments are an order of magnitude more efficient at sequestering carbon than forests, but Maine has a much smaller area of these environments. While marsh and eelgrass restoration aren't highly cost-effective in terms of carbon sequestration alone, according to ERG's analysis, they also noted that these environments provide many additional ecosystem services like flood protection, enhancing fishing, and increasing nearby property values. Thus, blue carbon projects should be implemented based on where they can maximize ecosystem service values, but not strictly implemented as a way to sequester carbon alone. And lastly, high quality information is essential to support science-informed decision-making and the most effective allocation of limited resources. This includes filling gaps in data where we have little or none, for example, in ocean acidification and allergens, improving the scale of data to support local decision-making, and collecting new data to encompass emerging conditions like invasive species and disease. Maine is well positioned to undertake long-term research projects associated with forestry, agriculture, and natural lands in particular, both as a leader and as part of national and international networks of ongoing research efforts. So this action area calls for both near-term funding to make better use of existing data and fill gaps where we lack essential information, and sustained funding to allow us to monitor and respond to changes in the future. And 92% of survey respondents to the Coastal Marine Survey favored this action for their communities. This action area also urges the state to develop a model for gathering these data and a system for sharing them so that public and private sectors decision makers can respond constructively to climate change impacts for more resilient outcomes. Substantial climate change data are already being gathered by governmental and non-governmental organizations. However, efforts are often poorly coordinated and chronically underfunded, and significant data gaps remain. Providing easy access to relevant information also supports more effective technical assistance mentioned earlier in this strategy. The Coastal and Marine Working Group identified the lack of appropriate local scale information in many areas of Maine as an equity issue and urged the development of regional specific information to help identify vulnerabilities and more appropriate climate solutions in those areas. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to turn it back to David.
Thanks, Cassie. We are not on break, just to be clear. You can drop those slides up. Thanks. Excellent. Okay, wow, that is a lot of information. I'm going to do you all a favor, and I'm going to share a high-level summary of what you just heard. And we can all sit on this for 1 second. Take a look at this. What this does is summarizes what Brian and Cassie just shared. All right? These are the big ideas. Let's just sit with these for 1 second, and then I'm going to ask a handful of you to give some initial reflections. But take a look. This is what we just heard. Okay. We're going to see this slide again later today, and obviously we'll share all these slides with you. But I wanted to give you that look across all that good information we just heard. Okay, let's get some initial reactions from you. And I've asked a handful of folks, Hannah has asked, and I've asked a handful of you to provide some initial quick hit reactions. Let's all keep our cameras on. We don't need to do our usual turn the cameras off routine. Let's keep our cameras on now, our video on. And I'm gonna ask Commissioner Amanda Beal to just give us a couple reflections. And what I've asked in terms of these reflections is, do we have the core levers right? Right, that summary slide I just showed, right? Is this package of core levers really the right kind of package to get us to where we want to go over the next 30 years, right? So on a high level, are we hitting the right notes? And then the second question I have is, okay, if we like that overall package, what really are priorities for implementing now, right? Starting January, where, just as Melanie spoke in this morning, what do we need to do right now? What are our priorities among this package of really good ideas? And we can drill it down to more of an action step type comment. Okay, so Commissioner Amanda Beal, please, very interested to hear your reflections on, you know, seeing this big package and what it means for priorities in the short term.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, as I'm listening along, I did review the report. I didn't, like Kate, memorize every word, but I've been through it, and there's a lot to digest there, and I definitely want to spend more time with it. But I do feel like we have really hit on those core levers, and I do feel like we've, you know, there's a good suite of strategies here that really could help us gain some ground. So I think it's exciting, and it's great to see it all coming together. In terms of what do we need to do right now, I mean, I, of course, was very involved in the Natural and Working Lands group, co-chairing that working group. And so my mind has really been on those strategies for, you know, in thinking about what I wanted to say today. But what I do want to say as a disclaimer is that in our group, and I know I've said this before, we did not talk about prioritizing the strategies that we came up with. So anything that I say is really just my own opinion and not reflective of the working group. So, but I do think that, you know, it's important to note that all the strategies that we came forth with both have the potential to address adaptation and mitigation. So that's a lot of bang for your buck. And I do think that they are the right strategies. And I think, you know, I was going to say a few things, really try to emphasize the point about the connection between our natural and working lands base and our economy, and the potential to sequester carbon in the future. But I think Cassie really did a good job of covering that. But I guess I do want to put sort of a finer point on it, in that I do think our first strategy, the one around you know, protecting and conserving lands, in my mind, this is just critically important, because if we don't get that right, we lose the opportunity to reap the benefits of all of the other strategies that our working group came forward with. And as Cassie noted, we are actively losing land to development, and that trend will accelerate. And you know, in terms of a cost-benefit analysis sort of point of something to think about, land prices only continue to go up, right? And so there will never be a more a more economically, just the potential to protect land now is going to be, it's important for us to do it now. It will just only get more and more difficult to find the funding to do it. And I think the other point I really just wanted to make is there was that comment about agriculture and farms being a source of emissions. And I just want to say that aside from the practices that ERG pointed out, there are additional practices that actually help to really drive carbon sequestration, and that farms can be a sink. And I think we have more to talk about on that front, but I don't want that to get lost in the conversation here. I think also the piece about technical assistance and incentives to landowners is going to be really critically important, and because you know, it helps to there are practices that landowners can be implementing that, again, both get at mitigation and adaptation and build resilience into those landscapes. And so that it reminds me of what Melanie was saying in our last meeting about co-benefits. And I think that that's something we should really be thinking a lot about when thinking about all of these strategies. There's a bigger picture here, and I think that if we start thinking and talking more about co-benefits, the things that emerge as what we can do now and what is most important takes on a little bit more weight. So I think I'll stop there and pass it on.
Thanks so much, Amanda. That's really, really interesting. Commissioner Kelleher, I'd love to hear your reflections as well. Where are you on mute?
He's on mute. There he goes. We're teaching him day by day about Zoom. There he goes.
Slowly learning how to navigate my way through this. David, I think your response after the presentations was, wow, that's a lot. That's certainly, as I was looking at that slide and seeing it broken down, it is a lot. And when you think about a 30-year planning horizon, it's clear that we need to be adaptive, right? I mean, we're thinking about what might happen down the road, but clearly things are changing fast. And I appreciate Commissioner Beal's comments. I think her comments while reflecting areas of her expertise are very similar to mine as I think about where we need to go. You know, currently we're knee deep in looking at the development of biennial budgets. As we're developing budgets and trying to think through how the work of the Climate Council will be funded in the long run, it becomes clearer and clearer to me that this is going to take an all hands on deck approach with all of our partners. The state can't do this alone. We need to have very strong partnerships as we move forward in trying to make determinations on what the next steps will be, and certainly the next 4 years. You know, spent a lot of time thinking through the efforts and the work of the Coastal Marine Working Group. Some really key components of that really ring true to me. We think we know a lot about what's happening in the marine environment. We continue to reflect on how the Gulf of Maine is warming just about faster than any place on the planet, but we really need to know more about what the impacts are. We know we have shifting species into the Gulf of Maine. There's a lot of conversations on how we're going to access those species, but we need to do more monitoring and better monitoring to ensure that we understand how warming water is impacting species that we do have, whether it's a sea urchin or a scallop or specifically lobster. We're, for the first time, you know, we talk about lobster a lot from a management perspective, but we do have this October at the next ASMFC meeting, a stock assessment coming out that really for the first time is going to incorporate warming water into that assessment. And that'll be critical for managing that stock for the future. A lot of talk about working waterfront as well, infrastructure and protecting that infrastructure. I think I've talked to a lot of people about how we could use working waterfront money to expand the efforts of resiliency on the coast, but we have to remember that a lot of people are applying for working waterfront not so they can raise the level of their dock to think about sea level rise, but they're doing it for other infrastructure, other business needs. So as we're looking at protecting those facilities, we need to think about that $1 million number that was thrown out for planning around working waterfront, because it's going to cost hundreds of millions to adapt our working waterfronts to sea level rise. And then interestingly, the Maine Seafood Business Council, when I read that, I was like, this isn't a seafood business council, this is a marine business council. We need to kind of, even though there's a focus on the seafood side, I think the idea of bringing people together into that type of a council that can look at these coastal issues beyond the seafood side, but the infrastructure side, technical assistance side, all of those components are going to be critically important. So with that, I'll shut up because I think I'm going to start just reiterating what Commissioner Beal said. But I certainly, I just one final thing, just thank all of the working group members and staff and the efforts of staff, because it certainly is a very thorough report and one that I think will give us good guidance going into the legislative session and planning beyond that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Commissioner. Excellent. Okay, well, we've identified 3 of you who we'd like to hear from first, and then we'll take a break and come back and have a discussion among all of us. If we stick with the marine side of things and the coastal side of things, Patrice McCarron, if you want to offer some thoughts, we know you've been up since 5 a.m., so I'm sure they're crystal clear.
They'll be riveting, I promise. I agree with a lot of what the 2 commissioners said. It is an overwhelming amount of information, and this is only part 2, and we've got to reintegrate this with what we talked about last week, which is even more to digest. I think the framework for this section is strong. I think we've covered all the bases, and it's a nice way to filter the information and think about how we're going to move forward. In terms of priorities, obviously, as a representative of the lobster industry and Maine's fishing community, the focus on supporting Maine's natural resource economies, I'm very happy to see that. In terms of the infrastructure, you know, we need to support our 30,000 plus fishing jobs, and we need access and infrastructure to do that. So I support Commissioner Kelleher's comment about the needed investment and sort of wrapping our heads around, you know, preserving those places to actually execute that part of the economy. We don't want to lose progress. In terms of moving forward and maintaining our resiliency, I think the monitoring piece is huge. As Commissioner Kelleher said, we know a lot about marine fisheries and the marine ecosystem, yet there's so much that we don't know. And as we experience these climate impacts, management of these species takes place largely outside the state. So the more armed with information we have to go forward and advocate for our communities to have flexibility and be able to diversify among species is really going to be critical to our success moving forward. And that's going to take sustained funding, and that's something we've really suffered from. So exploring what the state's role is and potential partnerships with ENGOs will be really big. And then the last piece is, you know, how do we engage our stakeholders in the marine sector to join us in moving this effort forward? And, you know, the Marine Seafood Council, the Marine Business Council, whatever it's going to be, to have the monitoring and have the investment to begin to translate that information and help our stakeholders understand what's actually going on. And in terms of the investments we may make as marine stakeholders, we're going to need that technical assistance. We're going to need to know what sort of financial incentives are there, what sort of technologies are readily available so people can make those investments as they're, you know, growing or changing their businesses. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Patrice. Really interesting. Okay, if we switch over to forestry, Pat Strauch, I wonder if you want to say a few words from your perspective. And I'll just note that Amanda Beal and Pat and I, less than a week ago, we're doing a similar panel with the Economic Recovery Committee. So these issues are very linked between climate and economic recovery. So Pat, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I have internet challenges, but are you hearing me okay?
You're good.
Okay, good. No, I've been able to participate also as a member of the Natural and Working Lands Committee, so I've had a lot of exposure to some of these ideas, and I thought they were well portrayed today. The importance of forests is to this state, and its ability to sequester carbon is just amazing. Many times I want to manage expectations about how far we can go with that. These are private lands, and and we have to appeal to the private landowners and work with them with regards to what the possibilities are. And I think the report levers that started talking about reaching out to small landowners who don't even know what they may have on the back 40 is critically important to that strategy. So that's important, smaller woodlot owners, and having that technical assistance. I think that came out in the report drafts that we're looking at, and that's a pretty cheap investment in getting outreach and education to those landowners, and it helps to make sure we're conserving our forests, and landowners that have choices about what to do with their land. They have many. That's really a key to the strategy. The report also, the lever that I thought was important is to link forests and their ability to survive on the landscape with markets. At least the working forest model really needs markets. And I think that's an important linkage to make. The wildlife and the recreational value tied to markets. And I think we talked about that. What's unique about wood products is that they are part of a bioeconomy that we could be emphasizing even more, I think. CLT is understood. We talked in agriculture about biochar. Well, I have some facilities looking at creating biochar from wood. So the linkage is really important, and I think we could probably do some more there. And then we're going to expand in the forestry sector. You're going to see more expansion taking place. So this gets back to how do we attract that kind of expansion? So we can't lose sight of what are our energy costs. How do we attract capital? So for me, I have to look at all of the report, both mitigation and adaptation, in order to be able to have a plan that looks at that circular economy we can make. And I'll end with R&D, particularly, well, not particularly, but we can demonstrate in our field that the use of CO2 and nanocelluloses and other sugars that can be made from wood that will enable us to make plastic. That's just critical to us diversifying our portfolio in Maine and making an even stronger economy that supports the ability of our forest to be healthy and vigorous. So it all goes back how. So I think we're on the right track, and we could enhance some more concepts as we go.
Thanks, Pat. Really interesting. Okay. We had asked one more person to give us some quick reflections, and that's Ivan Fernandez, who you'll remember is chair of your the technical and scientific subcommittee. If I'm saying that correctly, I apologize.
Close enough.
Close enough. All right, Ivan. You know, you've got a really strong view of the science going on here. When you look at these suite of levers, you know, how are you feeling? What do you see as priorities? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the framework is very impressive as far as what the GoPIF crew has done in trying to integrate all of the information, and there's a lot of it. I think a lot of my thoughts were probably well framed by Commissioner Loisam's summary at the beginning, having to do with how our job fits with issues of process, issues of timelines, both our timeline as a process as well as timelines of what the atmosphere sees, what we need to accomplish in bending the curve. And then how do we get to prioritization within all of these choices in the reality of the world we're living in right now on many different levels. Yeah, I'm very thrilled to see the emphasis across the board in all different sectors on nature-based approaches. It's very Maine, it's usually cost-effective, and it will endure for longer periods of time than often our more engineered approaches of the past. I still struggle with how we move forward in prioritizing. In the ideal world, we'd want benefit cost analysis, life cycle analysis, the equity analysis, all at our fingertips within the full framework to say, this is what's most important. This is the trade-off if we go one way versus the other. We have some of that. We'll have more of that. But we're gonna have to make decisions faster than we'll have everything we want in some arenas. And so doing that, I think I'm still learning about how this process goes forward. And sort of the nod to the need to make decisions is that a lot of things we're talking about are things that are actually not new. You know, the importance of farmland and forests and preservation and planning and things we've been doing all along. We need to do more of. That's what a lot of the discussion is. But we need to do a lot of it faster than we have, because the climate change is accelerating and a lot of the trends that we're addressing are accelerating, and our ability to respond needs to accelerate, which is even more challenged in these times. I think it's important to spend more time on evaluating ecosystem services. And we, you know, I certainly recognize and value, that's not my area of science per se, but nevertheless, the importance of blue carbon in coastal ecosystem services. I hear and Dr. Rose mentioned the intensity of carbon sequestration in those ecosystems on a per area basis, which is factually correct. But you know, the importance that they provide across a range of ecosystem services to both wildlife and humans is really important, and trying to quantify that so that it has more impact on our decision making, I think is going to be an important part of how we prioritize going forward. I think one size does not fit all. So we talk about some of these categories, from farms and forests to fisheries and community planning. There's a challenge for making it local, just like there is for the need for information about change that's local. And so those are just kind of reflections about the overall, I think, great program. You, David, started by with the question of, do we have the right core levers? My initial response in my head was, no, we need a price on carbon. But for what we can impact right now, I think, yes, we have a lot of the essential framework to go forward. It's the process of how we get there and the timeline that I think the most about. And then as a university research scientist, I think a lot about how does the university and its partner research institutions around the state contribute to meeting these needs, both in the short term and the long term, and also how do we direct that research to the highest priorities? Because often research is hampered by competing at a national or even an international level for funds. And as you might imagine, the national perspective is not always symmetric with local needs here in the state of Maine. And so how do we both direct that and fund that effort going forward? So I think I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Ivan. That's great. Okay. Why don't I do this? I would like to do two things and then we'll take a break. I'd love to hear from Kate Dempsey before we, because you have your hand up, Kate. And then Anya has a question in the chat that I want to answer. And then let's take a break. So Kate, let's go ahead. I'd love to hear what you want to say.
Sure. A couple things I just wanted on, because there are some questions in the chat about some of the culvert data that the Nature Conservancy and some other partners have been working on for 13 years or so. One piece I just want, in terms of urgency, I just want to make sure the whole council is cognizant, I think we are, that we shouldn't only focus on coastal flooding. a huge risk to Maine people and Maine communities is inland flooding. And the strategy of work, we have an approach in place with DOT and many private landowners and USDA, but that's a place where we really are going to see vulnerability impacts in inland communities as well as some specific coastal communities. That's in the report, but I just wanted to bump it up from Brian's point. I think there's some talking about co-benefits, some phenomenal resiliency co-benefits with the construction industry, municipal planners, et cetera. We can talk about that more later. To Representative Bloom's question, the state we have data on all, both municipal, state, and private land road stream crossings. However, the private data is private data. So private landowners hold that information. We can, and we have the ability to share kind of the cumulative numbers, but we can't show any individual information that occurs on private lands. So we can help make sure, I'm sure Brian has access to that, but we can help make that available to the rest of the council. I just wanted to add that piece.
Thanks, Kate. That's really helpful. Okay, Anya had a question about how the sequestration gets calculated into the goals and the targets. And this is something that Melanie mentioned this morning, and I'll reiterate it now because I think it is confusing and worth mentioning. The goals of emissions reductions, excuse me, to 2030 and 2050, those goals are gross emissions reductions, and you don't get to count sequestration to reach them, okay? However, sequestration does count towards the carbon neutrality goal by 2045. That's the governor's goal. And, Melanie, Hannah, everybody shout out if I'm saying some very incorrect information. But my understanding is for carbon sequestration that happens in the forest or that can happen through blue carbon in the ocean, that could count towards the carbon neutrality goal in 2045. It doesn't make any difference for the targets that are legislative targets in 2030 and 2050. So just to be super clear about that. Okay, great. There's kind of a loud garbage truck outside my window. I apologize if you hear that. Okay, so why don't we do this? Let's go ahead and take a break, and I'll ask Cassie, that slide says we'll be back at 10:50. Let's not make that 10:50. Let's make that 10:45. Let's just take a 10-minute break, quick bio break here. We'll be back at 1/4 and we'll get going again in plenary. And feel free, go ahead and switch off your camera now or whatever you want to do. Take a 10-minute break, and we'll see you back in 10 minutes. And Cassie, if you could put up a slide that says we'll be back at 10:45, that would be fantastic. Thanks so much, everybody. Okay, folks, welcome back. We can go ahead and drop the slide, Cassie. Just gonna close my doors. People put their cameras back on. Okay, we're gonna get going here. So if folks want to turn their cameras back on, join back in. I'll give you just a moment more. Okay. So I'm going to put in the chat here, and I'm actually putting it in for everybody, including folks who are observing today, the two questions that I posed to our initial respondents, and I hope can guide our conversation as well now amongst all of us, right? I just dropped them again in the chat. It's really about thinking, how are we doing on this package of core levers, big ideas? So far, we've heard some very positive feedback on that. Do we have it right? Are there things we need to do? right? And then the second question is about, okay, if that's a great package of ideas, where do we want to put some chips right now, right? For a 1 to 4 year action plan. And what might that look like? Okay. So those are the two levels of conversation I hope we have today as we're reacting to what we saw. And we fully understand if we send you a 20-page document 24 hours before a meeting, you're not going to be able to read it fully. So, but in reacting to what you've seen, what you've known from the working group reports, there's great detail on all this in the working group reports. What reactions do we have about this package of ideas and the kinds of priorities that you want to circle around starting next month as you really develop an action plan based out of these suite of ideas? Thoughts, reactions, go ahead and raise your hands. If you're having a hard time with the hand raise function, just shout out. I see Christina Ford doing the hand wave in the screen. Christina, go ahead, and then I'll go to Sandy. Oh, wait, you're still on mute, Christina. Hang on one sec. No, I still can't hear you for some reason. I wonder what. You show
She's on mute. I'm seeing her on mute. So
okay. If you can find that little mute button, it's annoying. Take one more second.
I usually focus on the.
There we go. We got you. We got you.
I know where the camera is because I hate to look at myself while I'm talking. I have a number of thoughts. I read it all yesterday, and as everybody has been saying, it has a lot of stuff in it. I don't find it very well organized, and what I mean by that is I can't really discern what the purpose of the plan is. As it reads now, it seems like a compendium of really good ideas that might work together. The word co-benefit comes up often, but I don't see what a person who picks it up, or a selectman in Booth Bay up until a month ago, how a selectman would pick this up and understand what he or she might propose that the town of Booth Bay do. And I really had thought that that was what this part of the plan would be, that we have many municipalities in this state. I thought one purpose of the plan was to say, here are the kinds of climate change effects that will affect probably not everybody, but some towns. And so you pick out what you're worried about in Booth Bay, or I'll even use Booth Bay Harbor as a better example. Here we have a harbor. So we have a lot of waterfront businesses, not just fishing businesses. And so Booth Bay Harbor could look at this plan and say, okay, what do they tell me about sea level rise and what we could do? And that there would be an array of strategies, because a lot is known about this. There are hard solutions, there are the natural solutions, all of them cost different amounts of money. But in other words, a person who's trying to use this plan would say, okay, here's the problem I worry about. What do we know about what could be done about it? And this information, we don't have to invent it. I mean, there are a lot of states and municipalities that have gone through this process. And it's difficult in this state for the state to do much except provide assistance. And that assistance in the form of this plan is, as I say, something that would really help a town think, we have a lot of money. Okay, say Booth Bay has a lot of money. So we can do one that another town that doesn't have as much money couldn't do. Or we have things that we really have got to protect no matter what. And so that requires a hard solution. And so I'm just saying, I don't, when I read this whole report with many cross references and so forth, I don't see a really coherent strategy that someone could use. And I think that's possible to do. The other thing that I'll say about it, I mean, when Hannah was talking earlier about the headlines in the last couple of days, I feel a great sense of urgency. And I don't find in this report a great sense of urgency. And I think perhaps that's because we haven't prioritized, and that can come out of this later. But I think to say that we need to study a bunch of things before we can do anything seems preposterous to me, because I think we know a lot of this information. So I guess that's really a way of saying that what I did was read the introduction to the scientific report yesterday, and a lot of the verbiage that's in of these 45 pages is really unnecessary, because the introduction has it. It explains what climate change is and what it might do to you. And I guess I'm trying to figure out a way to make this report succinct and coherent and easy for someone to use.
Thanks, Christina. That's really helpful. And before I go to Sandy, I just want to make one comment, say one thing I'm hearing and make a comment. So I'm hearing clearly that whatever final product you all as a council make, it should be coherent for a variety of audiences, right? And have a sense of urgency, right? And have a strategy that feels applicable to different audiences, okay? One comment I want to make is the framework that got sent out this week and last week, part 1, part 2, is not your product. It was a way of pulling together the working group material and start to organize it. Your product is going to be something we create in October. And I think, Christina, your wise words will help shape that product. Sandy, why don't you go ahead, please?
Thanks, David. I guess I'm going to start out with a recommendation. When I opened up the draft strategies part 2 yesterday, I saw 4 goals. And the first goal was to increase jobs and economic opportunities in Maine. But I thought we were supposed to be working on how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Maine. So I might suggest that we reverse those 2, because we have to do the first, reduce the gas emissions. And that will lead to job opportunities across the state. So that's just one comment. Another, based on the great work of the Natural Working Lands Working Group, I just wanted to, I have a bunch of praise, and I also have a couple of questions that I'd like to have considered. For one, I always praise the conservation goals. We absolutely need a dedicated source of funding for Land for Maine's Future, whatever it takes to get ourselves into a position to work with environmental NGOs and to raise money across the state. This has been a popular bond issue for years. It'd be nice to make it permanent and have the funding to protect the forests, to employ or deploy the natural climate solutions that we know are out there. The best ways to sequester carbon is to keep growing trees. And we've got to grow them and we've got to manage them. We also need to let forests rewild and maximize their carbon uptake ability. So if we can have dedicated funding for land conservation, whether it's on the coast or whether it's up in the woods, we need to do that. We should be considering any kind of easements, should be considering the carbon benefits of the conservation easement as well. The state is covered by, we have 89% of our land mass is covered by forests. Half of them are smaller woodlots, mostly in the southern parts of the state. The other half are large, privately held commercial lands that are in the northern part of the state. The Natural Working Lands focuses mostly on offering incentives for small woodlot owners, 10 to 5,000 acres, to have incentives to grow their forests and manage them for maximum carbon sequestration and storage. Why stop there? If there are ways to incentivize private landowners who own large chunks of northern Maine in particular, let's look for ways to work with them, find out what they need, and help deploy resources so that we can get those forests into the carbon markets as well. And as Patrick Strauch recommended, we need more markets as well. I think the cross-laminated timber absolutely has many benefits, not only for jobs in the state of Maine, but also to store carbon in buildings. And if we can get some CLT plants in the state of Maine, that would be awesome. And biofuels and bioplastics, all these are kinds of things that are great markets for renewable forest management as well. So I can't not say I agree with Andy Pershing. I also can't not say that I agree with Ivan Fernandez. We do need a price on carbon, and we do have that, thankfully, with Reggie. Let's expand that as much as we can. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Andy. Great. Andrew.
Hi, thanks. I appreciate the shout out, Sandy. I think the thing I wanted to bring up was two quick things. So there's a quote in there, I forget where it appears in the document, about revising scoring criteria for state conservation funding sources to incorporate climate mitigation and resiliency goals into criteria and project selection. I think that language is critical, and I think that language needs to be pervasive as we think about the various places in the state's purview that get touched by climate change. So figuring out how to work language like that, basically to say "and climate change" in the kind of regulations and other policies that are available in the state, I think would be probably the lowest hanging fruit that we could do from this committee. One thing I want to do is talk about just research priorities and monitoring really quickly. So I agree with Ivan that having some dedicated funding to direct at the state's needs is important, but we also shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there's so much more research money out of state, and we actually have really great institutions and scientists in the state who are really good at pulling that money in and accessing that, and helping them to have a framework to direct it towards climate goals would be really valuable. So things like the state research and development priorities, like the MTI priorities, those end up having a really important role in determining things like the way the state goes after the NSF EPSCoR grant that the university leads every 5 years. So that's a $20 million grant that directs a lot of research and development in the state. And so making sure that the state's language around R&D points towards climate needs, climate resilience, and the technology that we need to decarbonize the economy and adapt, I think would be really valuable, and it would allow us to help direct some of those federal sources towards the needs of the state. And then the monitoring conversation, I think, was really interesting. It was nice to see that get tighter and get closer towards pointing at particular goals. I think there's one gap in that the monitoring doesn't talk about monitoring for carbon in any way. And so we're really one of the things we're spending a lot of time on is making sure that we're thinking about the whole carbon budget of the state, not just the emissions, but also the sequestration. And so we really need to monitor that sequestration side of it as well. So as an example, California this year is not going to be, their forests are not going to be a net, they're actually going to be a source of carbon, not a sink this year because of the fires. And that could happen to us at some point. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Andy. Lydia Bloom, please go ahead.
Thank you. Boy, that was just a whole bunch of little information there, lots of information that I'm just absorbing from Andy Pershing. But I guess what I wanted to say initially, that I think from a high level, you've got it. I think the core values and the way this is presented is good. I'm concerned that maybe we're not stressing enough peer-to-peer. Like when it comes down to mitigation, when it comes back to adaptation and resilience, it's really about the town's work, the locals, the regional work. And we need to stress more peer-to-peer development of that conversation, so people can learn from, for example, that map that was shown that has what towns have resources, what don't, who they're doing well, other parts of the state aren't. How do we get a peer-to-peer network of what works someplace and what could work other places? I mean, is that, I want to stress that I think that may be more important than state down for resilience planning. It really is about bringing people together and regionalizing the work. And then also, I'm very concerned for all this work that we're losing staff in the DEP, in DMR, and this is really impacting what we're able to do, what we want to be doing now, and I can't even understand, if we want to try to do anything more. People aren't getting their aquaculture leases because I've heard that the DMR has laid off some people, or not laid off. They're not there, and so this whole thing about staffing in the departments to be able to do any of this, I'm seeing that as a real problem going forward. And so, the mitigation, that has to be from the state level, but the adaptation resilience is probably going to have to come from the funding that was earlier. Andy Pershing was saying, bringing in more funding to help these towns. So anyway, I think the fiscal picture in what's happening right now and what we want to do, we've got to somehow bring those things together, and it bothers me a great deal.
It's challenging for sure. Anya, right? Please go ahead.
Thanks, David. Yeah, just two things. And again, like Kate, I haven't been able to really dive into the full draft yet, but just based on the presentations this morning and what I've been able to read, just referring to your initial question, David, of the core parts of the draft, I just wanted to bring up two things. First of all, in terms of resilience, I would love to see more in terms of public education and education of folks on climate science and climate resiliency within public school. A lot of friends who are still in high school are really concerned that climate change education isn't a part of the core curriculum. And so that's a big gap that I see. Another thing that I just wanted to bring up, and it's possible that Melissa Law might be able to talk about this more than I'm able to, because I'm certainly not an expert, but just thinking about the section on agriculture, feeling some real concerns about food security, as 90% of our food in Maine comes from out of state. And I'm a little concerned just about the only strategy in there being about climate smart agriculture. And I would love to see some more put into that strategy on the topic of food security, especially as Andy just mentioned, the fires in California, where California is the fifth largest or the fifth leading supplier of food in the world. And so if we're seeing a lot more things across the globe in terms of food security, I feel it's really important for us to stress food security within the state. Thanks.
Great, Anya, thanks so much. So folks have said a lot of really interesting ideas, and it's hard in 40 people to get a feel of like how you are reacting to those ideas. But I want to push you to say, as you hear each other say these thoughts, right? What Anya just said, what Andy said, what other people have said, how do you react to it? Is anybody having a reaction like, oh, actually, I have a very different view on what was just said? Do people want to support some of the things that were just said? We really need to start to figure out like where we are as a group and start to react to each other and have some conversations. I see, Christine, are you trying to get the floor again? Oh, wait. That asking you button.
I got it. Thank you.
Okay.
One of the things I really was happy to hear from Sandy, I had the same reaction he did, where the first goals of, it says Maine climate goals, and the first one is create jobs and economic opportunity. I thought that should have been number 4. And the first should be reduce the greenhouse emissions, prepare us for climate change impacts, ensure that our strategies are equitable, and then create jobs. So thank you, Sandy.
Great. We may need to get some marketing folks in to help us out with this. Some political savvy folks. Andy, go ahead, please.
I guess I want to offer a little bit of a counter perspective. And that's that I don't think they're separate. I think that what we're talking about here, if we do it right, there are tremendous opportunities around creating jobs alongside reducing emissions. So I think it's I know we're kind of thinking about a list, but they're really tightly connected. And there's a lot of the discussion around how you decarbonize an economy. It creates opportunities, and I think highlighting those opportunities would be really valuable, especially as we have to sell this. And the legislature has to think about their votes.
Yeah, great. Okay. Other reactions as you hear each other speak on these ideas. Pat, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, no, just some perspective. I mean, we could, if we were counting molecules and wanted to trap all of the carbon we possibly could in our forests, we might be able to do that, but we would do that at the expense of our communities and some of our forest industry. So I think that that comment to talk about jobs up front is a reminder that we have to strike this balance of the environment, the economy, and the social aspects of all of this. And I know this is an imperative situation that we're in, but we can't forget, you know, Maine's rural economy needs to survive with the solutions that we come up with.
It's very interesting how that list of goals is sparking a more profound conversation amongst you about how we understand our own goals in going and doing this work and these priorities we need to weigh. Melissa,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks to Anya for bringing up food security, because that's really at the top of my mind. And I think, you know, there was some mention in the most recent document about strengthening our local and regional food systems, but, you know, looking to thinking about resilience, I think that strengthening our local and regional food systems really needs to be a primary focus. And I think that, you know, that relates to agriculture, but of course also to the marine and, you know, fisheries industry. And then I'd like to also just second what Andy spoke to, which is, you know, we have a lot of institutions and systems in place already and programs in place already. So I think it's really important that we look at incentives that already exist across our state government and programs that already exist and figure out how to infuse climate language into those programs. And, you know, I'm more familiar with the agriculture side of things, but I think that, you know, especially with cuts in funding due to COVID-19, starting with what already exists and figuring out how to prioritize climate within institutions and programs that we already have here in the state should really be a foundation for our climate action plan.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks. Commissioner Kelleher?
Thanks, David. I just wanted to set the record straight on what Representative Bloom made a comment on about laying people off. We have lost funding, federal funding for one position, but we're not laying people off. As she recalls, we had a request for supplemental budgets, but COVID impacted that. So we're still, COVID is what's delaying leases, not layoffs. So just wanted to clear that up.
Thank you, Commissioner Keller. I apologize for that. I tried to correct myself as I said it.
Great, thanks for that. Commissioner Beal?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to echo what both Anya and Melissa were saying about the food security piece. We actually did have a fair amount of conversation about that. And if you look at our all the backup documentation that we submitted a while ago, it does appear as a sub-strategy in two of our strategies, actually, number 2 and number 5. We don't explicitly use the term food security, but what we do talk about the need to strengthen our food system and produce more food here and make it more accessible. And just one other point I'll make to that, that figure, you know, 90% of the food that we consume comes from elsewhere. When you think about it, if we don't look toward producing more food here for a lot of different reasons, we don't really have the control over what kind of practices are used in that food production, and we're still going to eat. And so if we don't think about some strategies to relocalize that production and using those climate smart practices, then we're just exporting our carbon footprint, essentially. So something we really want to think about.
Thanks. Thanks, Amanda. Daniel Cleveland, you had a comment. You just texted me. Dan, you want to go ahead?
I want to follow up a little bit more and tease out what Andy was saying a little bit earlier when it comes to when we take this plan to the public. I think it's incredibly important that we reset the paradigm through which we're pitching it. And I think all too often, we've all seen it, climate action is proposed as a sacrifice. That is, people are going to have to give up something. We're going to take something away. It's going to be tough, but we have to do it. I don't think that's right. I think that there's tremendous opportunity in what we're proposing, and we have to pitch it as such. There's economic opportunity. There's opportunity for people to live healthier lives, whether it's through reduced incidence of asthma, Lyme disease. There's opportunity for people to live in safer, more comfortable homes. So in terms of, how are we going to get public buy-in to this, which is at the end of the day is crucial, and private sector buy-in. I think just recasting the paradigm through which we're viewing this plan is going to be extremely important.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks a lot. Ken Colburn?
Thanks, David. I'd echo Dan's reflections, a good segue. It's becoming clear that funding will be a foundation to all of these efforts. Brownie circulated, Senator Carson has circulated an earlier thought about an overarching need for a climate response or resiliency fund. I agree with that, but I also differ with it because we are not at the point in terms of climate change yet, though approaching rapidly, where response is our only option. We still have the opportunity to invest, which is to say, make expenditures to avoid greater costs in the future and to provide greater benefits in the future, including the opportunities that Dan just cited. That may take the form of a carbon price or leveraging private finance through green banks or consumer-owned utility, but whatever form it takes, let's not shy away from it. These are investments. We don't apologize for needing to build bridges or schools. We don't apologize for our university system. All of those are investments, and that's where we stand with respect to climate. And rather than facing recovery costs time after time after time, let's think in terms to the extent that we can, understanding it's a global problem, yada yada, of investment rather than simply, do you know how much that's going to cost? Thanks.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks so much. Okay, other reactions, things that people are feeling right now when you hear each other speak about these issues, when you think about the content that was shared today. Anything else we want to share right now?
David, I just want to say, this is a really helpful conversation, and I'm actually struck how much we're kind of back to communications and how do we explain it. I mean, there's some, and honestly, like a lot of what people have brought up is somewhat in these reports. There's a few things missing, a few helpful comments like Anya suggesting the education idea, but I think it's interesting. It's a lot about emphasis and how do we package this and sell it to people, whether that be the legislature, the governor, or the people of Maine. So I just think that really speaks to our sort of how Melanie and I kicked it off, sort of the items that are about implementing this plan, and it is a lot about communication. That being said, clearly the discussions of funding and implementation are also really key. And even going to sort of Christina's, one of her early points about, what does a Maine community see in this? Clearly we want this ultimate document and plan that we come up with to be something understandable, something Maine people could look at and know what we're talking about when there's a lot of climate terminology. But I would say this is not the only work product that will be seen, like, a selectman or a community planner on Vinyl Haven will look at this report and maybe find something helpful for it, but it won't be the only thing that sort of we all as state government and as leaders produce that will help be their framework for action. It's really the roadmap that we're providing here is sort of our charge.
Yeah. Thanks, Hannah. Yeah. Okay. So in that spirit, I want to show a couple things real quick, and then we're going to take a quick temperature of you all of how you're feeling about all this. I wonder if Brian or Cassie, you could pop up the summary slides just for a moment. If you remember, after Cassie and Brian's presentations, I showed you a summary slide of all the resilience and sequestration big ideas. We have a similar slide for what was presented last week as well, which is the big ideas, the big levers for emissions reductions. If we can back up one slide and start with the emissions reductions one, that'd be great. Great, thanks so much. Oops. If we back up one more. There it is. Okay. So take a peek at this. Just take a moment and read it. I think it's big enough to see. You can do full screen for yourself if it's feeling a little small. Maybe just my reading glasses needed one notch up. These are the three big strategy areas, and there's 8 plus 5, 13-ish big ideas underneath them. Okay. Oh, even better. Thanks, Brian or Cassie. Just gander at these. This is what we showed last week. Okay. Take a look. I'm not going to read them off. Just take a look. Read through them for a sec. Oops, that's a little too big there, Cassie. Okay, so those are our big ideas, the big levers to get us to 2050. Okay, if we go forward one slide, let's look one more time at this. This is what we talked about today, our big ideas from today. I don't know, Brian, if you want to verbally or otherwise try to say what you heard that might change some of this, if there's anything you want to say about that based on today's conversation. Brian, is there anything you want to share?
Not at the moment, David, but I did catch some things in the next slide for you.
Ah, great. So let's pop forward one more slide then. And here are some things that we heard today, right? These are things that you said in your reflections after you heard the reports. And this is Brian and Peter being very speedy and taking some notes. Let's take a look through these for a moment. Great. Okay. You'll recognize those because we just talked about them, 15 minutes ago, some of them. Okay. So now what I want to do is one more slide here, which is, if we can go forward the next one. Okay. Those were between the emissions reductions ones and the resilience and sequestration ones. Those were 24 big ideas, right? The levers that get us to Maine's 2050 goals, okay, and other goals. Where we need to go to, and then is getting to a little more specificity on the action steps that need to be implemented now-ish, right, in the next 1 to 4 years. There's a lot already in the working group reports on these action steps. This is not something that you as the Climate Council need to start from scratch. There's a lot in there, right? But it's taking some big ideas and turning them into, well, who needs to do what and what kind of resources, right? A more practical piece. So let me give you a couple examples here. This is straight out of the working group reports, but it's trying to drive us to the report that we'll be producing in October, in November. Cassie, if you could just sort of click 1 or 2 forward on this. So For instance, one of the big ideas is increase electric vehicle use, right? Sounds great. We all love it, right? Has some real challenges in rural Maine. But what does it really mean in terms of a climate action plan for the next 1 to 4 years, right? Some of the ideas that are already out there in the working group reports are, we need to do a more comprehensive EV expansions plan and study, right? And we need to do that across different sectors that care and can be helpful to private sector and public and others, right? That's a step. We could start that in January, right? We need to potentially adjust or expand the incentives for voluntary conversion, right? For buying vehicles. If we put an equity lens on that, what does that mean in terms of used vehicles, maybe? Electric hybrid vehicles, okay? So we need to think about that and make some, put some ideas out there. And there already are some from the working group. And now we have cost benefit analysis to know sort of why you would put an incentive at a certain price. Okay, let me do one more example. Again, I'm not trying to say these are the answers. I'm doing this. There's a lot of question marks for a reason in my examples here. All right, another emissions reductions one from last week, right? Improve the design and construction of new buildings. Well, what does that mean in terms of an action step in the next 1 to 4 years? Well, we need to start now in understanding how we're going to phase in building codes with the goal of reaching net zero by 2035 or before or after, whatever, right? Again, I'm not putting a number in there, except that's what came out of the working group, right? We need to establish mechanisms to expand and increase code compliance, whether that's through training, capacity, code enforcers, technical assistance to towns, whatever it is, right? Okay, that's the kind of shift that's going to be happening in October as we take these big ideas and turn them into actions. And one of the things we've been encouraged to hear both today and last week is that on the level of big ideas, it feels like we're kind of hitting the mark, right? But to make sure we actually are and to make sure we're headed in the right direction, let's take our temperature right now. And I'm going to ask that Sophia send in the chat to the panelists, to the Climate Council members in the panel, a link to a quick poll. This is a 2-question survey. And I'll ask our Climate Council members and others who are joining us today as panelists to go ahead and click through that. You don't need to put your name in, skip that. That's not relevant, just push skip if it asks for a name. And we'll have 2 questions. I'll let you read those and answer those. The second one's a word cloud. So just add in a couple words. I think you can add up to 3 words. Great. So Heather, Leslie, are you struggling to find that link?
David, this is Christina. I can't find it either.
Okay. So in Zoom, just if you click at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a black bar and there's a button that says chat. If you click on that button, it'll open up a chat window off to the right. And in that chat window, the latest thing from Sophia is the link to the poll. Would it helpful if we send it to your email?
I just emailed it to all the Maine Climate Council members. So if you can't find it, feel free to check your email.
Excellent, Cassie. Wonderful. Let's just give it a moment more. And Sophia, you can let me know when we look like we have a good number of respondents.
Yes, we're just still waiting on the second question. Just note, folks, that you have to click through to the next one and submit. You can submit up to 3 words. Okay, it looks like we've got 28 people answering. So as you guys submit, we'll see more. So the survey should be active. Not quite sure why things might be disappearing.
You have a hand raised, David, from
Oh, sorry.
Benedict.
Hi, Benedict. Do you have a question?
You'll need to unmute Benedict.
It's Benedict.
Yeah, so the survey disappeared on me. As I
think
That's-
Heather,
I just-
can you, if you click it on again, will it open back up?
And this is just it's just a challenge. It's a mind game that we're just trying to play with certain Climate Council members. Test your internet skills.
All right, I got it back. Thank you.
Sorry about that, guys. It was not our intent to make this a technical quiz. All right, once we get up to about 35 answers, we'll probably start. I think how many we are. Wow, we're a lot of panelists. So we'll give it a second more. Let folks finish up.
All right.
What's our number now, Sophia?
We have 18 done and 19 underway.
Okay, we'll definitely let people wait. When you're, folks, if you make sure you click on submit so it actually gets submitted. So in just a second, I'll ask Sophia can share her screen as long as she's a co-host. So Cassie, if you can make sure she's a co-host. And Sophia can share her screen with some results. But I do want to give you a second. We're asking for some thinking there. So I recognize it takes a little time to think, come up with some words, some ideas.
We're still ticking up, so.
Okay, I'm not in a rush. We're actually ahead of schedule, everybody, so that's good news. You may get a little of your morning back. So let's let people think and answer with some thoughtful responses and give another minute or two. All right, how are we doing, Sophia?
30 done, 8 underway.
All right, we'll give you some time. Remember, if you think you're done, just make sure you click that submit button. And while we're waiting, I'll just mention, for those of you observing today, the questions being asked of the Climate Council right now, one is, and you'll see it in just a moment when we do the the results, but one is about how are you feeling about this suite of levers, these big ideas, and our ability to go forward and make some action steps out of them. And the second one is asking for words or phrases that would help strengthen that suite of ideas. And that will hopefully show as a word cloud if the technology gods are with us today. So you can expect that, observers. In just a moment, we'll see real-time results from those. So the intent of doing this is to take our temperature, and it's hard in a group of 40. It's hard over Zoom. You don't get any of the physical sort of signals and things. So this is our effort to take the temperature of how we're feeling, and we need to react to what the results are. Sophia, looks like you've got something to share here. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so on the inspirometer piece, how are we all feeling about this package of high-level ideas and our ability to make meaningful action steps? Hang on just 1 second. Yeah, if we keep that up, it'd be great. So the good news there, folks, is between good and inspired, we've got a clear majority. I'm not quite sure what happened, just Sophia, we don't see the results right now.
Sorry, give me 1 second. My computer is misbehaving right now.
Okay, again, the technology gods, they really need to be in our favor. But if you remember what that just showed us, right? The vast majority of us were feeling okay, good, or inspired, right? There's some of us that are feeling so-so, okay? That's okay, we're a big group. We need to work with everyone. So if you're feeling so-so, this is a good time to reach out to Hannah or Melanie or me or others. And we can talk about that and figure out how we're going to move forward. I'm personally encouraged to see the level of inspiration and how people are feeling positive about this, okay? And luckily, nobody's running for the hills yet. Okay, let's see if that word cloud comes together and see if we have some interesting ideas about what it looks like to strengthen.
Take a second to load here.
Technology. Sometimes it is.
Well, everywhere is rebelling against me today.
It's all right.
Sorry about that.
So one of the things we can do as we're waiting for that, if that's not coming up immediately, I wonder, Sophia, if you can wrestle with that, we'll stop the share. And I wanted to have a conversation about that first question anyway. And so why don't we have that conversation? And if we get lucky with technology, we'll be able to share the results of that word cloud as we get forward, if Sophia can figure out what's being buggy today. Okay, the question I had for folks is, you know, what is making you feel inspired about this process? Let's name it right now, because it's good to name that. We're at a critical juncture of making a pivot from getting some big ideas and then making a deeper dive into the substance, the working group reports, and understanding what that means for actions. It's an important moment, so let's name it. So for those of you who's felt good, inspired, what is prompting that feeling inside of you? Let's just have a quick conversation about that, and we're going to end a little early today as well. But I'd love to hear from folks. What's prompting that response from you? Go ahead and shout out. You can raise your hand.
I'll start. I'm inspired and I feel good, really good about how this process has gone so far. I'm really inspired by the work of GoPIF. I think that they've done an incredible job, and I really, really mean that. And I feel like now it's our job to move this thing forward and to refine it any way that we need to. But I am inspired by the organization of this group, considering everything that we've been through in the last few months and how hard everyone has worked. So that's very inspiring to me.
Thanks, Lydia. Michael Stoddard, I saw your hand was up.
Yeah, thanks, David. I got to say that as overwhelming at times some of the national news has seemed of late, I think I'm also feeling that the national mood around the existence of climate change and the importance of doing something about it is just so different than 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 20 years ago. It's getting to this place now where I feel like what we're doing now is on the front edge of what everyone's going to be doing and talking about at the state and local and national level for the next decade. So I think this work is like its time has come. And there are some heavy lifts, things like carbon pricing, which have always been really, really tough to sell on a state-by-state basis. And I feel like we're approaching this point where everyone else in the country is, whether they like it or not, is going to be catching up and thinking, okay, we really probably are going to have something like that. And I think that's going to make some of these really hard things a little bit easier. And I think the work that we're doing is going to put us ahead of the curve. So I feel good about that.
Thanks, Michael. Senator Brownie Carson. I think you're still on mute. Yeah.
Thank you, David. I think I unmuted now.
Very good.
I think Christina's point, the very first comment made today, was a really important one that we must remember. The material we produce for the public and the action steps that we recommend must be practical, valuable, and compelling. Having said that, and still being somewhere in the kind of okay to feeling good range, what's at stake? And I think we need to communicate without being hyperbolic or can't think of the other word I want to use, is that the true essence and the way we've lived our lives, the way we have made our living, and the infrastructure that we have built in Maine are at risk in a very real way. People like Andy Pershing and Ivan and several others have addressed that, I think, and I'm sorry I can't remember everyone else, have addressed that in a very effective way. And what we need to do is we need to carry that message with enough facts to back up the necessity of acting seriously and acting now without sounding alarmist, which unfortunately will still play into the dying gasps of climate deniers and people who say this isn't real and you're overreacting. So I think we've come to a good moment. I personally believe that the people of Maine will respond to strong, even-handed, fair leadership on this. And I believe those people from Hannah and Melanie to many of the people who are involved here can all play a role, and that we not only can do this, but we really need to do it now in a measured, effective, and compelling way. And I want to thank you for your facilitation and just thank all of my colleagues for really digging in. And I mean, the work ain't done, but we've got a very good foundation and the time for action really is now. Thanks, David.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Ken, want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. I too was among the good respondents, and I'd echo Michael's sensibilities. I reference a quote by a retired Admiral Denny McGinn, who said, knowing the right thing to do is the starting point. Implementation is the hard part. And I think that we are at that juncture, and that's okay. I mean, we can't dawdle, but we know the right thing to do at this point, and there's pretty good consensus about that. Thanks.
Thanks, Ken. Benedict?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, you know, I feel really good about the process so far has been very deliberative and systematic in how we're going through this. And I think great opportunity to build some synergistic incentives and policies that can both mitigate climate emissions and do great things for our economy. I think those are things we should focus on, and we'll build a lot of momentum and acceptance by doing that. So I think we have a great opportunity ahead of us as we work through this, and as long as we continue to be deliberative and in our process and rational, I think we can make some good decisions and really add to the state of Maine.
Thanks so much. Thanks for your comments. Okay, anything else people want to share before we round up the day? Okay, I think we had kind of a technology fail on that word cloud. I apologize. Are there things that people feel very compelled about that they put in there that they want to mention now? Because we may not be able to show that to you as I would like.
This is Sophia. I think that it's really big, but I have like a little screenshot of it that I've zoomed in on. I can show that hopefully you guys can read, at least to get the gist of it.
And we can share it back. Yeah, that would be great if you want to share it.
Figure out why it's being funky today. Just so you can see that your
I see, yeah.
phrases didn't go to waste, but
right.
Here's what it would look like.
That's great. Yeah, no, you can see it clearly. It's fine. Okay, so climate, action, communications, people, right? These are big words that came across frequently. Okay. Do folks want to comment on that about sort of why you put something in there? Are you surprised to see those words pop up or not other words? Any comments people want to make about that? Matt, go ahead, please.
Sure. Yeah, I put this in the chat earlier, and I know it's been woven a little bit throughout. I would just encourage us to bring a sharper focus in the recommendations, in the communications around the job creation and economic development dimensions of this, and to also really think about, in the places where we do talk about jobs, there's virtually zero mention of job quality, and what are our mechanisms to ensure job quality. And I think we know that a lot of the kind of jobs we've seen created in these sectors have been pretty low wage, low benefit, low skill, low training kind of jobs. And I think there's a real opportunity to change that, but it doesn't happen by itself. And so I think that economic vision piece is integral to the success of this, the opportunity embedded in it, and our ability to move it. And I think it, just making a plug for including it more centrally in addition to the Clean Energy Economy report. And yeah, I think.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, thanks so much. Appreciate that. Anya, go ahead.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so my word was urgency, and relating back to the last question too, I was in the so-so category, just because I would love to see more of what the cost-benefit analysis and what the science is telling us in terms of how urgently we need to act. And yeah, I think I'll just continue to say that again and again, but also I think weaving in the role that Maine plays on a national and global scale too, in terms of setting an example for others all over the world. Definitely urgency is something that is continuing to float to the top.
Thanks, Anya. Thanks so much. Kate, want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what not to repeat. I don't want to repeat what all my colleagues here have said, but Matt, that was a really great point. And I think, again, making sure we're prioritizing the places where there's these real co-benefits that are presented in the plan so far, the framework in terms of resiliency, good jobs, and the benefits of climate mitigation. I just also want to echo something, Anya, that got added to the slide. I too have heard a lot from Maine high schoolers about their real desire to see climate education as part of their curriculum, just core curriculum, core understanding, because they understand the workforce urgency perhaps even better than we do. And they want to stay and live and contribute to this state, but they're feeling like they're not getting that foundation of knowledge. And so I just want to echo what Anya had said earlier to pull that out.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks so much. I'm just going down the list here. Lydia Bloom, please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to remind everyone of the importance of the cost of doing nothing analysis, which I think really it's so helpful to monetize what the future holds, and I feel that that analysis, all of that analysis, is very important to us going forward and to selling this idea. I really appreciate that work.
Thanks so much. One quick note I need to make is that we talk about the cost of doing nothing. It's actually the cost of doing what we're currently doing, right? So it's not like everybody goes home and stops working. It's like, if you just keep doing what you're doing, this is the cost. So it's catchy to say cost of doing nothing, and we know it's actually the cost of our current policies if we don't take additional steps. Yeah. Patrice, please go ahead.
I really like the pivot in the communication focus to, not threatening people about inaction, but really highlighting how taking these steps is going to benefit all Mainers. And I just want to put a plug in. It's not only about highlighting new quality jobs and economic opportunity, but there's also the piece of preserving and sustaining the existing high quality jobs that we have in the natural resources sector. So I wouldn't want anybody to perceive, we need to build offshore windmills, and who cares if, we lose a few fishermen along the way. It's really that balancing act of preserving what we have and adding new quality jobs along with that.
Thanks. Absolutely. Yeah.
David, I think it's easy to change the cost of doing nothing. Just make it be the cost of doing nothing more.
Right. Add that one word. Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Christina. Okay. I see Amanda Beal. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was sort of struggling with how to say this in a succinct way for the word cloud exercise, but I think it relates back to the piece that Kate and Anya were just talking about regarding education. And that's another thing that really came up and we talked a lot about in our working group. And so I guess what I would just say is that there's so much richness to those discussions that had happened in the working groups. And I feel like as we're sort of evolving to language that is maybe a little bit easier to digest, we might be losing some of that richness. So I would say, if there's a way we can look back and maybe pull more of those pieces through the data and the strategies, the more of the granular kind of detail about what we've talked about already, I think that would be good.
Thanks. And that's a common refrain I've heard because there's so much great thinking that went into the working group process. And I myself was going into it last night to make that slide for you. It's like, it's all right there. There's lots of great information. Okay, so let's round up today's meeting. Before I turn it over to Hannah to finish up, let me just say one thing about a question that was raised at the top of the meeting, and it's about how are we going to do this? Like, how are we going to make decisions as a group? How are we going to function as we start to build a product ourselves as a Maine Climate Council? Let me suggest that we're going to confirm our approach at the beginning of our next meeting, October 1st, I believe. But I'll signal where we're headed with this, which is the same way we tried to work in the working groups, the same way other large groups like the Economic Recovery Committee is working. And that is, this group should aim to have one consensus-based output, right? A report, and we'll tell you more what that's going to look like in October. It's not going to be the framework documents that we've been sharing this week and last week. It's going to build off those and take in the good comments that you've also had today. That is a single output that we want this, you all as a committee, as a council, to produce. And to be able to do that, it has to reflect the ideas that have broad acceptance among you. We know that some ideas are tough or controversial, or people might have different views on them. And we're going to do everything we can to consolidate and address those concerns so that we do have a single consensus document. when we do have issues where we simply just don't agree, all of us, on those particular issues, we can include different viewpoints inside that single document. So if there's one specific thing where, you know, there's a lot of support for it, but a handful of you feel really uncomfortable and have a different view, we can include that other view right in the document. Say some of you felt this way about it. That's fine. The key is we have a single document. We're not voting in the sense of, you know, 51% or anything. We are trying to create something that reflects really where you are as a group, okay? No majority and minority report, nothing like that. What we'll have is on specific issues where we simply just can't get there, we can include those different viewpoints in the document itself that's our product. We will confirm that approach at the beginning of the next meeting and make sure that you all are on board with sort of how your own internal governance is going to work and your decision making is going to work.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
The science and technicals group work, that 365-page document that is great, a document that has everything in it. Are we going to vote on accepting that as the science behind our work? I mean, because that has happened in other states where it's important to say, this is the science, this is what we believe, this is what we're basing our thoughts on. I'm curious on what your thoughts are on that.
Can we get back to you on that? Go ahead, Hannah. Yeah.
I was gonna say, Representative Bloom, that's a good question. And actually, Melanie and I were talking specifically about the sea level rise projection, which was a specific legally mandated output of that document, which there are components by law that we do need to sort of review and consider and accept. So I think your question is well placed, and I think Melanie and I will talk about it and bring it back to this group for kind of thinking about that. There's other outputs, like we're working on the Clean Energy Economy report, another required component of the Climate Council law. And that's another document where we'd be looking for input and then acceptance and support. So I think as these things kind of all come together to inform our plan, I think your suggestion is a good one. For folks, we're going to talk about it just in a minute, sort of upcoming opportunities to learn more about what's in these very detailed reports. The Science and Technical Committee's report is incredibly impressive and also very lengthy. And so I think we need to weigh, like, do people feel comfortable? What is sort of our role in accepting all of that, and are we the right group to do that? So
yeah, thanks. Melissa, did you want to comment on that specific issue?
Yeah, I just had a quick question for Ivan about how much that draft has changed since it first came out. I think that the final product just was released this past week, and I haven't had a chance to really understand how that's changed.
Yeah, just really quickly, in some chapters, not a lot, and in other chapters, a fair amount. And there's some new chapter or two, I think, that are in it. So how much it's changed is kind of uneven based on the chapter that you would ask about. But some significant change, and all of the chapters have been sort of revisited by the authors and edited further.
So definitely worth taking a second look.
Yeah, Lydia was wrong. It's 369, not 365 pages. So, but yeah, please do.
Okay, there's a great executive summary. Okay, so Hannah, could you walk us through next steps? And I thought I was going to give you time back this morning, but I'm not. But Hannah, could you walk us through next steps and what to expect from now until in October?
Yeah, I'll just be very brief. And again, thank everybody for a really good meeting and a lot of helpful comments. Cassie, do you want to put up those 2 slides? So just really next steps, I think the most important thing are our upcoming meetings. We have set up a couple of meetings, 2 for next week, 1 still being finalized. We know folks are busy. This last 2 weeks have already been a lot of time out of working schedules, but we are going to do a more detailed overview of the cost benefit analysis with the consultants from ERG and Synapse. So this is really an opportunity to dig into details and ask questions. The beginning will be their presentation, the end will be questions. So if you can't stay for the whole time. The next one will be a webinar on the report we were just talking about, the scientific assessment. Again, time to hear in more detail about what's in that report. And we're also working to finalize the equity assessment. The Mitchell Center is almost done with their draft, and we want to present it to those who have time and answer questions. So these 3 things are coming up. If you can't attend, we will record them. Certainly, again, each of these things have a lengthy document, so this is just really intended to be extra if you want to ask questions and understand any part of these. And again, I know, just again, you're all busy. These are not mandatory. These are kind of optional periods if you want to dig in more, because I know there's a lot in each of these reports. Next slide is just what our next dates. So October 1st and October 21st are the 2 dates. We're meeting in October, and this is really getting deep into the substance of decision making and starting to talk about implementation. So these will be important meetings. We'll send you agendas in advance, and we would just highly encourage conversation in the meantime about, as you're reading, a concern you have, something missing, something you want to emphasize. The Thursday, November 12th date is the date by which we hope to have kind of a final draft of the plan to you for vote. And so the time between the 21st and 12th, there may be additional meetings required in between, depending on where we are and how it's going. But again, as I think Melanie said, well, this work doesn't end on November 12th. We're going to finalize our first action plan, and then this council will be charged with continuing to meet quarterly for the coming years to support the work and keep it going. So I will just say that there's a lot of heavy lifting next month. So again, communication with Melanie and I, the staff, with each other about things you're worried about. You all come from different areas of expertise. So, no one is going to be an expert on everything that we've talked about as a part of this plan, but a lot of you're here for specific, groups that you represent, for expertise, for leadership and departments. So everyone, we really expect you to do heavy lifting in the area in which you're an expert. The only just final thing I meant to add at the beginning is we actually have 2 folks who you may or may not recognize their names. One is Susan Bro, who is here representing the Maine Department of Health and Human Services. Both Dr. Shaw and Jean Lambrew are, not surprisingly, busy people. And so she's been serving as the DHHS representative. And Kim Moore just joined us today from the Department of Labor. Evie DeFries was the member on the council, and now Kim is here with us. She's got a lot of expertise in workforce, and we are going to hear next month about the Clean Energy Economy Plan. So I think her timing joining us is super helpful. So just welcome, Kim. And with that, unless there's anything else, David, just thank you all, and have a good couple weeks, and eat your vegetables, preparing for October 1st.
That's it. Thanks, everybody. Really excellent meeting. Expect notes from us about the key ideas coming out of this meeting, and we'll see you all October 1st, if not in those webinars. And do think about this content, right? Go back to those working group reports. There's opportunities to prepare here, and we'll be giving you some more specific ideas about those preparation opportunities. Have a great day, everybody. Take care. All the best. Thanks.